Hi everyone and welcome to Truth Over News. Since GOP leadership couldn't even be bothered to write a solid border protection bill to mask the Ukraine funding that they really cared about, the Senate decided to push forward with direct funding for Ukraine. After we've repeatedly thought this bill was dead any number of times, through an act of cloture, this reformulated $95 billion supplemental spending bill was passed in the middle of the night by the Senate. And by the time of this airing, will have moved on to the House, where it will hopefully have been squashed by Speaker Johnson. It's truly incredible that the awful Ukraine funding bill that started its life by masquerading as a terrible border bill was resurrected, albeit in a new form, despite immense pushback from the conservative base. But as we'll see shortly, it's even worse when you get into the details. And it shines a bright light on cooperation by GOP leadership with the Biden White House, Democrats, and the intelligence community. The fight over the Ukraine funding also highlights a developing and ongoing battle between the new guard of GOP congressmen and the old guard of the establishment GOP leadership. A bill that started its life by pretending to provide for our border protection when it actually would have facilitated illegal immigration has now been reformulated to send more than $95 billion in foreign aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, while providing nothing for our border security for our own nation. And we can't say this enough. The original bill was a complete disaster, with funding for a large number of NGOs or non-governmental organizations. As we discussed last week, many of these NGOs are already getting huge amounts of money from U.S. taxpayers, money which is actually coming from federal funds, including our own State Department. And those funds, which run in the billions of dollars, are then used both directly and indirectly to fund illegal immigration into our country. The original border bill simply skipped the middleman and included $2.65 billion for refugee and entrant assistance activities. But this new bill is even worse. Its only real purpose is to provide another truly massive round of funding to Ukraine, to enable a war that was never winnable and is already lost. It's also designed to serve as the foundation for many more years of funding to Ukraine from the U.S. and from its partners. What all of this really highlights is the utter disdain that senior GOP Republicans have for their base. They care for funding endless wars far more than they care for the security of our own borders. It's truly astonishing. There's not one aspect of this bill that's positive from a domestic or spending perspective. Yet the GOP establishment frantically pushed to get this bill passed in the Senate, enraging their base in the process. There's also a poison pill provision within this new bill that's thankfully been highlighted by Senator J.D. Vance. Vance distributed a memo to Senate GOP offices on February 12th, arguing that the language in the Ukraine funding bill could tie Trump's hands if he comes into office next year, wanting to halt or pause the flow of weapons and funding to Ukraine, perhaps as a part of negotiations on ending the devastating and needless war that has already cost so many lives. As the memo from Vance notes, the bill includes $1.6 billion for foreign military financing in Ukraine and $13.7 billion for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. These funds expire on September 30th, 2025, nearly a year into the possible second term of President Trump. These are the exact same accounts President Trump was impeached for pausing in December 2019. In other words, the provision, which is effectively a kill switch mechanism, could prevent Trump from enacting his own foreign policy if he wins the presidency. Even more importantly, the provision potentially gives Democrats an avenue towards impeachment if Trump were to halt funding to Ukraine. As Vance notes, if President Trump were to withdraw from or pause financial support for the war in Ukraine in order to bring the conflict to a peaceful conclusion, over the objections of career experts, it would amount to the same fake violation of budget law from the first impeachment, under markedly similar facts and circumstances. Vance is right, and a late January 2024 article from the Washington Post gives away the game. The article states that the U.S. planning is part of a multilateral effort by nearly 36 countries back in Ukraine to pledge long-term security and economic support. But the success of that strategy depends almost entirely on the United States, because we are by far Ukraine's largest donor of money and equipment. We are also acting as the coordinator of that multilateral effort. Herein lies the genesis of the fake border bill that the GOP initially brought forth. As the Post notes, the Biden administration had hoped to release its own 10-year commitment, now being compiled by the State Department with the blessing of the White House. Assuming that President Biden's $61 billion request for supplemental Ukraine funding is approved by a recalcitrant Congress. The idea was to guarantee support for shorter-term funding for the war, coupled with a grand plan to build a future Ukrainian military force that can deter Russian aggression. Effectively, an expansion of NATO through Ukraine, which is really what got us here in the first place. But their grand plans face a major potential hurdle: a Trump presidency, which is precisely why they are trying to dictate the flow of funding into Ukraine while a compliant Biden is still president. All of this is why a member of the intelligence community anonymously told the Washington Post, "The hope is that the long-term promise, assuming congressional buy-in, will also future-proof aid for Ukraine against the possibility that former President Donald Trump wins his re-election bid." Now, keep in mind that this quote was given to WAPO back on January 26, nearly 2 weeks before the GOP leadership first introduced their fake border bill that was really designed to fund Ukraine. In other words, leadership of the GOP had been working hand in glove with the Biden regime when it brought forth the fake border bill on February 4th. As we all suspected, the funding for Ukraine was always the true purpose of the original bill. To be clear, GOP leadership worked directly with the Biden White House, Democrat leadership, and the intelligence community to craft a bill that was designed to deceive conservatives on border security in order to establish long-term funding for their true goal, Ukraine.
Open the champagne, pop the cork. The Senate Democrat leader and the Republican leader are on their way to Kiev. They've got $60 billion they're bringing. I don't know if it'll be cash in pallets, but they're taking your money to Kiev. Now, they didn't have much time, really no time and no money to do anything about our border. We're being invaded. A literal invasion's coming across our border. 800,000 people came illegally in the last month, and all they had time to do in the Senate was get the money, get the cash pallets, load the planes, get the champagne ready, and fly to Kiev.
If you still hold any doubts that we face unified opposition from our own representatives, that we are fighting against an entrenched uniparty, those doubts should now be thoroughly debunked. The purpose of this legislation is to provide funding to Ukraine not just in 2024, but into the future as well. And through their strategic positioning of the 2025 funding, the true purpose of this legislation is revealed. It's designed almost entirely to tie a potential President Trump's hands in 2025. In other words, they're trying to make it impossible for the next president to conduct diplomacy as he sees fit. It's designed for the continuation of endless wars. As J.D. Vance told Tucker Carlson, if Trump is elected president again and becomes the president on January 20th, 25, he will conduct diplomacy. And if that diplomacy does not include sending additional billions to Ukraine, there is a theoretical argument, a predicate, if you will, for impeaching Donald Trump because they have tried to tie his hands. Nor is Vance engaging in breathless hyperbole. The language within the new Ukraine funding bill presents a real problem if passed. As the House committee report on Trump's first impeachment states, the president froze military assistance to Ukraine against U.S. national security interests and over the objections of career experts. Ukraine experts at DoD, the State Department, and the National Security Council all argued that it was in the national security interest of the United States to continue to support Ukraine. Agency experts also expressed concerns about the legality of President Trump withholding assistance to Ukraine that Congress had already appropriated for this express purpose. Congressional appropriations have particular relevance because of the Impoundment Control Act, which restricts the president's authority to delay spending of congressionally appropriated funds only if Congress is notified of those intentions and approves the proposed action. Trump's supposed violation of the Impoundment Control Act was a key finding in his December 2019 impeachment. It's also worth noting that the amounts involved were far smaller than the amount embedded in the new Ukraine funding bill, a total of $782 million from 3 different agencies. The amounts in the current bill are much larger, $1.6 billion for foreign military financing in Ukraine and $13.7 billion for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. There are other differences as well. Trump merely delayed the funding in 2019. Were Trump to take action in 2025, he would likely cancel the funding. Additionally, Ukraine was not engaged in an active war in 2019, and Democrats still used it to impeach Trump. The feigned outrage this time around would likely be deafening. The threat of impeachment described by Vance is very real. As for those supposed experts we mentioned earlier, Vance had some choice words.
So many times in the last many decades have we been asked to listen to the experts, and yet we never actually ask what the track record of those experts is in matters of foreign policy. The experts, the bipartisan consensus, of course, got us into Vietnam, a war that lasted nearly 15 years that saw the destruction of nearly 60,000 American lives, and for what? It was the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, the experts, that got us into a 20-year war in Afghanistan, where American taxpayers for 2 decades funded things like how to turn Afghanistan into a flowering democracy, or how to ensure that the Afghans had proper American thoughts about gender in the 21st century. Well, maybe that was a waste of money, and maybe the experts were wrong. Those same experts, of course, counseled us that we must invade Iraq because Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and yet Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and the war led not only to the destruction of 5,000 American lives and many, many hundreds of thousands of innocent people beyond that, but also led to the regional empowerment of Iran, which now we are told by those same experts is the biggest problem that we face in the Middle East. Now those experts have a new crusade. Now those experts have a new thing that American taxpayers must fund, and must fund indefinitely, and it is called the conflict in Ukraine.
Failed experts aside, the level of outright deception by GOP leadership is what makes this whole episode particularly disturbing. The intelligence community was leaking to the media in January about future-proofing aid to Ukraine. In response to obvious behind-the-scene talks, GOP leadership introduced their fake border bill several weeks later. A bill that did nothing for the border, but did fund further illegal immigration into our country through flows of cash to UN-based NGOs, along with their all-important $60 billion for Ukraine. In other words, the old guard establishment GOP leadership actively coordinated with the Biden administration, the intelligence community, and congressional Democrat leadership to deceive their base with a fake border security bill that would have actually made the illegal immigration situation more dire and had at its core the establishment of long-term funding for their true goal, Ukraine. GOP leadership's disdain for its base was so great that they couldn't even write a solid border protection bill to mask the Ukraine funding they really cared about. And when the initial bill failed, that same GOP leadership doubled down to push a new bill that ignored the border entirely, but accomplished their real goal of funding Ukraine in perpetuity. And to do so, they wrote the bill in such a manner that it set up a future President Trump for failure and possibly impeachment, making it virtually impossible for him to end the Ukraine war as he has long promised to do. If we had a real party, every single member of the old guard GOP who provided support for any of the bill's iterations, including this new supplemental bill, would be held accountable and even primaried. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.